You always make it about you, Mom. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, spoken by the son I had sacrificed everything for. I felt my heart shatter into 1,000 pieces right there in my own kitchen. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you for just 1 second feel like this sounds familiar, please leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me keep sharing these stories that need to be told. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 67 years old, I thought I knew what love looked like. I thought it was the worn apron tied around my waist every Sunday, the smell of pot roast filling my Chicago apartment, and the sound of my family's laughter echoing through rooms I had carefully decorated with their photos and memories. The kitchen table bore the scars of decades of family meals, ring stains from countless coffee cups, a small burn mark from when David was 8 and knocked over a candle during his birthday party, scratches from homework sessions with my grandchildren. Every imperfection told a story of a life lived for others. I had spent the morning preparing David's favorite meal, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, exactly the way his father used to make it before the cancer took him 3 years ago. The meat had been simmering since dawn, filling my small apartment with the rich, comforting aroma that once drew my family like a magnet. I had set the table with my mother's china, the delicate blue pattern she had saved for special occasions, passed down to me with the promise that I would use it to bring joy to my own family. The apartment felt smaller these days, not because anything had changed, but because the silence between visits stretched longer and longer. The walls were covered with photographs spanning 40 years. David's graduation from Northwestern University, his wedding to Sandra, the births of my grandchildren, Emma, now 16, and Tyler, 14. In every photo, my smile was radiant, my arms wrapped around the people who gave my life meaning. David arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, as he had every third Sunday for the past 2 years. It wasn't the weekly tradition it used to be when Sandra was alive, before the divorce that left him bitter and the children shuttling between homes. He looked tired, his expensive suit wrinkled from a long week at the law firm, his once thick hair now thinning at the crown. At 42, he carried the weight of a man who felt the world owed him more than it had delivered. "Smells good, Mom," he said, hanging his coat on the back of a chair, never the closet where it belonged. It was a small thing, but lately, I noticed all the small things. The way he checked his phone while I spoke, the way he never asked about my doctor's appointments anymore, the way he looked at me like I was an obligation rather than his mother. I served him a generous portion, watching his face for the smile that used to light up when I cooked his favorites. Instead, he picked at the meat with his fork, his mind clearly elsewhere. "How was your week?" I asked, settling into the chair across from him, the same seat I had occupied for every family meal in this apartment. "Busy. The Morrison case is taking up all my time." He didn't look up from his plate. I wanted to tell him about my week, about how I had volunteered at the food bank on Tuesday, how Mrs. Patterson from down the hall had fallen and I had stayed with her until her daughter arrived, how I had finally finished the photo album I'd been making for Emma's upcoming birthday. But something in his posture told me he wasn't really listening. "Emma's birthday is next week," I ventured. "I was thinking we could have a little party here. Nothing fancy, just cake and—" "She's got plans with friends," David interrupted. "You know how teenagers are." I nodded, swallowing the disappointment like a bitter pill. "Of course. What about dinner then? Just the 3 of us?" David finally looked up, and in his eyes, I saw something that made my stomach clench with dread, impatience, irritation, as if my simple request for family time was an unreasonable burden. "Mom, you need to understand that Emma and Tyler have their own lives now. They don't want to spend every weekend sitting around here eating pot roast." The word stung, but I pressed on. "I just miss them. Miss us. Remember when we used to—" "That's exactly what I'm talking about." David set down his fork with more force than necessary. "You always make it about you. Your feelings, your needs, your nostalgia for some perfect family that never actually existed." The room went silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. A wedding gift from 43 years ago that had outlasted my marriage, outlasted my husband, and now seemed to be counting down the moments until it outlasted my relationship with my son. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice smaller than I intended. I just want to be part of your lives. And that's the problem, Mom. You want, you need, you miss. It's always about what you want from us, never about what we might need from you. I felt something crack inside my chest. A sound so real I was surprised David couldn't hear it. This was the child I had rocked through countless nights when ear infections made him cry. The boy I had worked double shifts to afford baseball equipment for, who I had driven to practice in a car held together with prayer and duct tape. The young man I had helped through law school, taking out a second mortgage on the house his father and I had almost paid off. I've given you everything, I said, my hands trembling as I reached for my water glass. Everything I had. Everything I was. And there it is again. David stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. Everything you've given. Everything you've sacrificed. You keep a running tally of every good deed like you're collecting evidence for some cosmic court case. I stared at him, this stranger wearing my son's face, speaking words that felt like physical blows. The pot roast sat cooling between us, ignored and unwanted, just like the woman who had spent 6 hours preparing it. I never asked you to sacrifice anything, he continued, his voice rising. I never asked you to work extra jobs or take out loans or live in this tiny apartment because you gave us the house. Those were your choices, and now you want us to spend our lives making up for decisions that were yours to make. The photograph on the mantel caught my eye. David at his law school graduation, his arm around me, both of us beaming with pride. I remembered that day with perfect clarity, how I had skipped meals for a month to afford the plane ticket to Boston. How I had worn my only good dress and felt like the luckiest mother in the world. In that photo, David's smile was genuine, his eyes full of love and gratitude. When had that changed? When had my love become a burden instead of a gift? I don't want you to make up for anything, I said quietly. I just want to matter to you. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that reminded me painfully of his father. You do matter, Mom, but not like this. Not with all these expectations and guilt trips and constant reminders of everything you've done. He grabbed his coat from the chair, leaving his dinner half-eaten on the plate. I'll call you later this week. But we both knew he wouldn't. The door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed like thunder in the suddenly empty apartment. I sat alone at the table, staring at the 2 plates, one barely touched, one not touched at all because I had been too nervous about his reaction to eat. The silence was deafening. No grandchildren's laughter, no excited chatter about school and friends and dreams. Just me and the ghosts of family dinners past, surrounded by photographs of people who no longer had time for the woman who had devoted her entire life to loving them. I began clearing the table with mechanical precision, wrapping the leftovers in containers that would sit in my refrigerator until they spoiled, because there was no one else to eat them. The china went into the sink to be washed by hand, each piece requiring careful attention to preserve the delicate pattern that no one would see again until the next disappointing family gathering. As I stood at the sink, my hands submerged in warm, soapy water, I caught my reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back at me was a stranger, gray-haired, tired, wearing an apron that suddenly felt like a costume for a role I no longer wanted to play. For the first time in 43 years of motherhood, I allowed myself to ask the question that had been growing in the darkest corners of my heart. Was I the problem? Had my love really become so suffocating, so demanding, that my own son could barely stand to be in the same room with me? The tears came slowly at first, then faster, until I was sobbing into the dishwater like a woman who had just realized that everything she thought was solid ground had actually been quicksand all along. Outside my window, Chicago glittered with lights from thousands of homes where families were sharing meals, making memories, and taking each other's presence for granted in the most beautiful way possible. And I stood alone in my kitchen, holding a plate that bore the faded remnants of a meal no one wanted, wondering if this was what love looked like when it had nowhere left to go. That night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself in the spare bedroom, the one that used to be David's, pulling out boxes of memories I had carefully preserved like sacred relics. Each item told the story of a mother who had given everything and received so little in return. The first box contained report cards spanning 12 years of David's education, not just the report cards themselves, but every note I had written to teachers, every permission slip I had signed, every fundraiser check I had written, even when it meant eating cereal for dinner for a week. There were programs from school plays where David played a tree or a pilgrim, performances I had attended alone because his father was working late again, trying to build the accounting practice that would provide for our family. I remembered those nights at Lincoln Elementary School, sitting in tiny plastic chairs designed for children, clapping enthusiastically for every student on that stage, because I knew how it felt when no one was watching. When David forgot his lines during the third grade Thanksgiving play, I was the one who whispered them from the audience, loud enough for him to hear but quiet enough to save his dignity. A photograph fell from between the pages of his fifth-grade report card. David at the science fair, standing proudly beside a volcano that we had spent 3 weeks perfecting. I could still smell the vinegar and baking soda, still feel the burn of hot glue on my fingertips as we worked together at this same kitchen table, night after night, until we created something that would make him proud. He won second place. The smile on his face in that photograph could have powered the entire city of Chicago. "Mom, you're the best science partner ever," he had said, hugging me so tightly I could barely breathe. "We make a good team." When had we stopped being a team? The second box held financial records that told a different kind of story. One of sacrifice measured in dollars and cents. Bank statements showing the gradual depletion of my savings account as David's college expenses mounted. The second mortgage papers, signed when my teacher's salary wasn't enough to cover Northwestern's tuition. The loan documents for his law school education, co-signed with my name in careful cursive, knowing that if he defaulted, I would lose everything. But I had signed anyway, because that's what mothers do. We bet our futures on our children's dreams. There were grocery receipts from those lean years when every dollar mattered. I had learned to shop the clearance sections, to plan meals around whatever meat was marked down for quick sale, to make a single chicken last for a week of different dinners. David never knew we were poor because I made sure he never felt the weight of our financial struggles. When his friends went to McDonald's after school, I found the money. When he needed new clothes for job interviews, I found the money. When he wanted to take Sandra to fancy restaurants during their courtship, I found the money. I found it by skipping meals, by wearing the same 3 dresses to work for 2 years, by telling him my old car was vintage, when the truth was I couldn't afford the payments on something newer. The third box was the heaviest, not in weight, but in emotional significance. It contained every Mother's Day card David had ever given me, from the construction paper masterpieces of elementary school to the store-bought sentiments of his adult years. The early cards were treasures, handprints traced in purple marker, poems that rhymed mom with bomb in the endearing way of 8-year-olds, drawings of stick figures holding hands under smiling suns. Each one declared his love in the innocent, absolute way that children express their feelings. "You are the best mom in the whole world," one card proclaimed in crayon letters that wandered drunkenly across the page. "I love you more than infinity times infinity." The later cards were different. Purchased rather than created, with pre-written messages that said all the right words but felt hollow, like beautiful shells washed up on a beach. Perfect from a distance but empty when you picked them up. The most recent card from this past May was particularly painful to reread. "Thanks for everything, Mom. Hope you have a great day. David." 15 words. 15 words to summarize a lifetime of devotion. I could remember when he used to spend hours making my cards, cutting construction paper with safety scissors, asking me how to spell beautiful, because he wanted to tell me I was the most beautiful mom in the world. When had those heartfelt declarations turned into obligation purchases from the Hallmark aisle? A manila envelope at the bottom of the box caught my attention, something I had forgotten I saved. Inside were the medical bills from David's childhood surgery when he was 12, when his appendix ruptured during a family camping trip, and we found ourselves in a rural hospital with no insurance coverage for out-of-network care. $23,000. A fortune for a family living paycheck to paycheck. I had negotiated a payment plan with the hospital billing department, committing to $50 a month for the next 40 years. $50 that meant generic groceries instead of name brands. That meant walking to work instead of driving. That meant telling David we couldn't afford the school ski trip while never explaining why. He never knew about those bills. Never knew that his mother spent 4 years of her life paying for the surgery that saved his. The final item in the envelope was a letter, one I had written but never sent, drafted during those darkest months when the financial pressure felt crushing and my marriage was crumbling under the weight of money stress. Dear David, the letter began in my younger handwriting. If something happens to me, I want you to know that every sacrifice was worth it. Every missed meal, every extra shift, every night I fell asleep worried about bills. All of it was worth it because you are the most precious thing in my world. I would give my life for yours without hesitation. I hope someday you'll understand how much you are loved. I had written that letter on his 13th birthday, sitting at this same kitchen table at 3 a.m, overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising a child whose future seemed to require more than I had to give. But I had given it anyway. Somehow I had found more. As I sat surrounded by these artifacts of maternal devotion, a bitter realization settled in my chest like a stone. David was right about one thing. I had kept a running tally. Not consciously, not as ammunition for future arguments, but as proof to myself that I was a good mother. That despite the divorce, despite the financial struggles, despite my own limitations, I had loved my son well. But what did it matter now? All these sacrifices, all these sleepless nights and empty bank accounts and postponed dreams. What did any of it mean if the person you did it for saw it as emotional manipulation? I thought about Sandra, David's ex-wife, and how she used to look at me during family gatherings. There had been something in her eyes that I never understood at the time, a kind of pity mixed with confusion. Once, during Thanksgiving dinner at their house, she had pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Margaret," she had said, washing dishes while I dried, "you don't have to do so much, you know. David's a grown man. He can take care of himself." I had laughed, thinking she was being kind. "Oh, I don't mind. I love taking care of my family." "But what about taking care of yourself?" she had asked, and the question had struck me as odd. Taking care of myself? What did that even mean when you were a mother? Taking care of your child was taking care of yourself. Their happiness was your happiness. Their success was your success, wasn't it? Now, sitting in the debris of my good intentions, I wondered if Sandra had seen something I was blind to. Had I been suffocating my son with love? Had my devotion become a burden rather than a gift? The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, and I realized I had been sitting on the floor for hours, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived entirely for someone else. My knees ached from the hardwood floor. My back protested from hunching over boxes, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the question that was growing louder in my mind. Was I used? The thought felt like betrayal, even thinking it. How could love be used? How could caring for your child be anything other than the most natural thing in the world? But as I looked at the financial records, at the years of sacrifice documented in black and white, a different story began to emerge. A story of a woman who had given everything, and a son who had learned to expect everything, who had grown comfortable with being the recipient of endless generosity, without ever feeling the need to question where it came from, or what it cost. I thought about David's apartment, the one I had helped him afford by co-signing the lease when he was fresh out of law school, the furniture I had helped him buy, the security deposit I had covered, the groceries I had stocked his refrigerator with during his first lean months at the firm. When was the last time he had asked how I was doing? When was the last time he had offered to help me with anything? When was the last time he had given me something that cost him anything? Time, money, effort, or inconvenience? I couldn't remember. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My son didn't see me as a person with my own needs, my own dreams, my own life worth considering. He saw me as a resource, a source of unconditional support that required no maintenance, no reciprocation, no thought beyond what he could extract from it, and I had trained him to see me that way. Every time I had said, "Don't worry about me," when he forgot my birthday, every time I had insisted I'm fine when I was struggling, every time I had prioritized his comfort over my own needs, I had taught him that my feelings didn't matter, that my life existed solely to serve his. The boxes around me suddenly felt like evidence in a case I didn't want to prosecute, the case of a mother who had loved so completely, so selflessly, that she had disappeared entirely, who had given away every piece of herself until there was nothing left but the role she played in someone else's story. As I packed the memories back into their boxes, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. I was going to stop disappearing. I was going to stop making myself smaller to make everyone else comfortable. I was going to find out who Margaret Chen was when she wasn't being someone's mother. The thought terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to choose myself. The coffee cup slipped from my fingers and shattered against the kitchen floor, ceramic fragments scattering like the pieces of my heart. But I barely noticed the mess at my feet. My eyes were fixed on the email open on David's laptop, the laptop he had forgotten on my kitchen counter after our disastrous dinner 3 days ago. I hadn't meant to snoop. I had simply been trying to find his contact information to arrange returning the computer. But when the screen lit up, an email thread was already open, and my own name caught my eye like a neon sign in the darkness. "Mom's getting unbearable," David had written to his sister Jennifer in Portland. "The guilt trips are constant. She acts like we owe her something just because she chose to sacrifice everything for us. I'm thinking it's time to have a serious conversation about boundaries." Jennifer's response was equally devastating. "I know exactly what you mean. She called me last week crying about how lonely she is. I felt bad for like 5 minutes, then remembered how she used to make everything about her when we were kids too. Remember the drama when I got engaged? How she made my wedding planning all about her feelings being hurt because I didn't ask her opinion on every detail?" My legs gave out, and I sank into the kitchen chair, my hands trembling as I scrolled through message after message. 3 months of correspondence between my children, discussing me like I was a problem to be solved rather than their mother. "She needs hobbies," David had written. "Something to fill her time so she stops living vicariously through our lives. It's not healthy for any of us. Maybe we should suggest therapy?" Jennifer had replied. "I mean, this level of emotional dependence can't be normal. Sarah's mom is the same age and travels, volunteers, has her own life. Why can't Mom figure that out?" Sarah's mom. I knew Sarah, Jennifer's college roommate who had become like a sister to her. I had met Sarah's mother, Patricia, exactly once, at Jennifer's college graduation. She was a vibrant woman who worked as a real estate agent, who talked about her book club and her pottery classes and her upcoming cruise to Alaska. I remembered feeling intimidated by her confidence, her obvious comfort with her own identity outside of motherhood. But what they didn't know, what Jennifer had never bothered to ask, was that Patricia had never been a single mother. She had never sacrificed her career to stay home with sick children. She had never chosen between her own dreams and her children's needs, because she had a partner who shared those responsibilities. The conversation continued, each message more brutal than the last. "I think the real problem is Dad spoiled her," David had written. "He always made her feel like martyrdom was admirable instead of helping her develop her own interests." I thought of Robert, my husband of 23 years, who had died too young from a heart attack that came without warning. Robert, who had worked 60-hour weeks to support our family while I raised the children. Robert, who had collapsed in his office on a Tuesday afternoon and never came home. How dare David blame his father for my choices? How dare he reduce our marriage, a partnership built on love and shared sacrifice, to some kind of enabling relationship? "The money stuff is getting weird too," David continued. "She keeps offering to help with things, then acts hurt when we don't need her help. Like when Emma needed a laptop for school and Mom offered to buy it. When we told her we could handle it ourselves, she got all quiet and wounded. It's like she needs to be needed in this really unhealthy way." I remembered that conversation. Emma, my granddaughter, had mentioned needing a new computer for her advanced placement classes. I had immediately offered to buy it, thinking it would be a wonderful way to contribute to her education. David's rejection had stung, but I had assumed he was just being independent, not wanting to burden me. I hadn't realized he saw my offer as manipulation. "Maybe we should limit contact for a while," Jennifer had suggested. "Not cut her off completely, but maybe space out the visits. She's become too dependent on us for emotional fulfillment. It's not fair to any of us, especially the kids. The kids, my grandchildren, Emma and Tyler, who I loved with the same fierce devotion I had given their father. The idea that my children were discussing protecting their children from me felt like a physical blow to my chest. I scrolled further back in the conversation, finding messages that went back months. My birthday had been discussed, not with excitement or planning, but with resignation. "I guess we should do something for Mom's birthday," David had written. "Maybe just dinner at her place? She'll want to cook anyway." "Can't do dinner," Jennifer had replied. "That'll turn into a 3-hour guilt session about how we never visit. Let's just do lunch somewhere public." Harder for her to get emotional in a restaurant. They had managed my birthday like a business obligation. The lunch at the Italian restaurant downtown, the one I had assumed they chose because they knew I loved their tiramisu, had actually been selected because it was a public space where they could control my emotional responses. Every casual comment, every seemingly loving gesture, recontextualized itself in my mind like a movie being played backward. The brief phone calls weren't signs of busy lives, but strategic boundaries to limit my access to them. The canceled plans weren't unfortunate timing, but careful orchestration to minimize our contact. The most devastating message was the most recent, sent just 2 days ago, after our confrontation. "Had another scene with Mom on Sunday," David had written. "She got all dramatic when I told her the truth about her behavior. I think she's having some kind of breakdown. Maybe we should look into senior living communities. She clearly can't handle living alone anymore." Senior living communities. They were discussing putting me away like a broken appliance that had outlived its usefulness. I was 67 years old, in perfect health, with a sharp mind and an independent spirit. But in their eyes, I had become a problem that required institutional management. My hands shook as I closed the laptop. But the damage was done. The words burned in my memory like brands. Unbearable. Guilt trips. Emotional dependence. Breakdown. Is this how they really saw me? The woman who had given them everything, who had shaped her entire identity around loving them, was nothing more than an emotional burden they strategized about managing? I walked to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger. Gray-haired, tired, wearing the confused expression of someone who had just discovered that her entire life was built on a foundation of lies. Not lies I had told, but lies I had believed. I had believed that love was supposed to be unconditional, unlimited, and unending. I had believed that being a good mother meant putting your children's needs before your own, always and without question. I had believed that sacrifice was noble, that selflessness was a virtue, that the measure of a mother's love was how much she was willing to give up. But what if I had been wrong? What if my children didn't want a mother who loved them more than she loved herself? What if my devotion had become a burden instead of a gift? The questions swirled in my mind like water going down a drain, pulling everything I thought I knew about myself into a dark spiral of doubt. I walked back to the kitchen, stepping carefully around the broken coffee cup I had forgotten to clean up. The ceramic pieces crunched under my feet like eggshells, and I thought about how fitting that was. Everything fragile in my life seemed to be breaking at once. The phone rang, and without thinking, I answered it. "Hi, Mom." David's voice sounded normal, casual, as if he hadn't spent months discussing my mental health with his sister. "I left my laptop at your place. Can I swing by and pick it up?" I looked at the computer on my counter, its screen dark now, hiding the conversation that had just destroyed my understanding of my own life. "Of course," I heard myself say, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'll be here." "Thanks. I'll be over in about an hour." He hung up without saying goodbye, the same way he always did. But this time, I heard it differently. This time, I heard the efficiency of someone checking an item off a to-do list, rather than the casual comfort of family conversation. As I waited for him to arrive, I swept up the broken coffee cup with mechanical precision. Each fragment that dropped into the trash bag sounded like a small bell tolling, marking the end of something I couldn't quite name. When David knocked on my door exactly 1 hour later, I opened it with a smile that felt like a mask. He looked relieved to see me acting normal, confirming what I had read in those emails, that my emotions were an inconvenience he preferred to avoid. "Thanks, Mom," he said, grabbing the laptop from the counter without meeting my eyes. "I've got a big presentation tomorrow. Would have been screwed without this." "Of course," I replied, still smiling that terrible, hollow smile. Anything for you. He paused at the door, perhaps sensing something different in my tone, but then shook his head and left without another word. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it, my fake smile finally cracking and falling away like old paint. For the first time in my adult life, I had lied to my son, not with my words, but with my silence. I had hidden my knowledge of his true feelings, had pretended ignorance of his plans to manage and contain me. And in that moment of deception, I felt a strange sense of power. If David could strategize about our relationship, could discuss me like a problem to be solved, then perhaps it was time for me to start strategizing too. Perhaps it was time to solve the problem myself. The thought was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. For 67 years, I had defined myself through other people's needs. I was Robert's wife, David and Jennifer's mother, Emma and Tyler's grandmother. But who was I when I belonged only to myself? Standing alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the silence that my children found so threatening, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. I was going to find out. And if the discovery process made my family uncomfortable, well, they had already decided I was unbearable anyway. What did I have left to lose? The next Sunday, I didn't cook. For the first time in 23 years of hosting family dinners, I simply didn't do it. Instead, I sat in my living room reading a novel I had bought months ago but never found time to finish, a cup of tea growing cold on the side table beside me. When David called at 5 o'clock, his usual check-in time to confirm dinner plans, I answered with a calmness that surprised even me. "Hi, Mom. What time should I come over for dinner?" "Oh, I'm not cooking tonight," I said, turning a page in my book without looking away from the words. "I'm having a quiet evening in." The silence on the other end stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. "What do you mean you're not cooking?" David's voice carried a note of confusion, as if I had announced I was no longer breathing. Exactly that. I decided to take the evening for myself. "But it's Sunday. We always have dinner on Sunday." "We do," I agreed. "Or rather, we did. I've decided to change that pattern." Another pause. When David spoke again, his tone had shifted to the one he used when he thought he was dealing with an unreasonable client. "Mom, are you feeling okay? Is this about our conversation last week? Because if you're trying to make some kind of point, I'm feeling perfectly fine," I interrupted. Something I had never done before in 42 years of being his mother. "And I'm not trying to make a point. I'm simply choosing to spend my evening differently." "This is ridiculous," David said, and I could hear him pacing, a habit he'd developed during law school when stress overwhelmed him. "You can't just cancel family dinner without notice." The word cancel struck me as particularly interesting, as if family dinner was an appointment I had with him rather than something I had been providing for his benefit. "I wasn't aware I needed to give notice for how I spent my own time in my own home," I replied, still turning pages, though I had stopped processing the words entirely. "Fine," David said, his voice tight with irritation. "I'll pick up something for Emma and Tyler. They're expecting dinner at Grandma's." This was the moment I had been both dreading and anticipating, the moment when my choices affected my grandchildren, the two people in the world whose disappointment I feared more than anything. "You should take them somewhere nice," I suggested. "Maybe that new pizza place Emma mentioned last month. I hear they have excellent arcade games." "That's not the point, Mom. The point is that you're being—" He stopped himself, but I could fill in the word he didn't say. "Selfish." "I'm being what, David?" "Nothing. Forget it. I'll figure something out." He hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me sitting in the sudden silence of my apartment, my book forgotten in my lap. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was Emma, my 16-year-old granddaughter, and the sound of her voice made my resolve waver for the first time. "Grandma? Dad said you're not making dinner tonight. Are you sick?" My heart clenched at the genuine concern in her voice. This was what I had been afraid of, hurting the innocent ones who had never done anything but love me unconditionally. "No, sweetheart, I'm not sick. I just decided to have a quiet evening. But we always have dinner at your house on Sundays. It's our tradition. Our tradition. Not their obligation or my desperate attempt to stay relevant in their lives, but our tradition." From Emma's perspective, these dinners weren't burdens. They were constants in a world where so much else kept changing. I know, honey. And we'll still have dinners together, just not every single Sunday. Is this because Dad was mean to you last week? Emma asked, and her perceptiveness caught me off guard. Tyler said he heard Dad on the phone complaining about you to Aunt Jennifer. So my grandchildren had witnessed their father's frustration with me. They had heard themselves being protected from their own grandmother, as if I was some kind of threat to their well-being. Your father wasn't mean, I said carefully. We just had an honest conversation about some things. Adults are weird, Emma sighed. Dad's been super grumpy since last Sunday. Mom asked him what was wrong, and he said something about you guilt-tripping him. But I don't even know what that means. David's ex-wife, Sandra, asking about his mood. Even his former spouse was more tuned into his emotional state than I was. Emma, I want you to know that nothing between your father and me has anything to do with how much I love you and Tyler. That will never change, no matter what. I know, Grandma. You're like the most loving person in the world. Sometimes I think you love us more than you love yourself. The innocent observation hit me like a physical blow. Out of the mouths of babes, my 16-year-old granddaughter had identified the exact problem that had taken me 67 years to recognize. After I hung up with Emma, promising to take her and Tyler out for ice cream the following weekend, I sat in my kitchen staring at the empty stove. For the first time in decades, I wasn't cleaning up after a family meal. There were no dishes to wash, no leftovers to wrap, no dining room table to clear. The silence should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt heavy with guilt and uncertainty. Monday morning brought the first real test of my resolve. I had planned to spend the day organizing my closet, a task I'd been postponing for months, when my phone rang at 8:30. Mom, I need a favor. David's voice was crisp and businesslike, the tone he used when he assumed compliance. I've got a last-minute client meeting, and Sandra can't pick up Tyler from soccer practice. Can you get him at 4? In the past, I would have immediately rearranged my entire day to accommodate this request. I would have felt honored to be needed, grateful to be included in my grandson's life, even in such a peripheral way. I'm sorry, David, but I can't today. I have plans. The pause was so long, I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Plans? What kind of plans? The question irritated me. Since when did I need to justify how I spent my time? Personal plans, I said simply. Mom, this is important. Tyler needs to be picked up and you're the only option I have. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You're very resourceful. Another pause, followed by a sound that might have been David grinding his teeth. Fine. I guess I'll have to leave my meeting early and get him myself. That sounds like a good solution, I agreed cheerfully. This is unbelievable, David muttered, apparently forgetting I could hear him. First the dinner thing, now this. What's gotten into you? Nothing's gotten into me, I replied. I'm simply learning to value my own time the way you value yours. He hung up without another word. The guilt hit me immediately. Tyler loved soccer practice, and the idea of him standing alone on the field, waiting for a ride that might be late because his grandmother had chosen organizing her closet over helping her family, made my stomach churn. But I forced myself to stay strong. David was a successful attorney with a flexible schedule and multiple resources. One inconvenience wouldn't traumatize anyone, and it might teach him not to take my availability for granted. Tuesday brought a text from Jennifer in Portland. David says you're acting strange. Everything okay? I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Everything's fine. Just making some changes in my life. What kind of changes? The kind that put me first for once. Jennifer's response came quickly. That doesn't sound like you. And there it was. The assumption that had shaped my entire adult life. That putting myself first was somehow contrary to my nature, as if self-care was a character flaw rather than a basic human need. Maybe it's time you got to know the real me, I typed back. The phone rang within minutes. Mom, what's going on? Jennifer's voice carried the same note of bewildered frustration I'd heard from David. First you cancel family dinner, then you won't help with Tyler, and now you're sending cryptic text messages. Are you having some kind of midlife crisis? I'm 67, Jennifer. If this is a midlife crisis, I'm planning to live to be 134. This isn't funny, Mom. David is worried about you. We both are. Worried. The word they used when my behavior inconvenienced them, but they wanted to frame their concern as love rather than selfishness. There's nothing to worry about, I said. I'm simply establishing some boundaries. Boundaries? Since when do you need boundaries with your family? Since I discovered that my family had been establishing boundaries with me for months without bothering to inform me, I thought but didn't say. Since I realized that loving someone doesn't mean making myself available to them 24 hours a day. Nobody expects you to be available 24 hours a day, Jennifer protested, but her tone suggested she knew the statement wasn't entirely true. Don't they? When was the last time either of you checked to see if I was busy before asking me to do something? When was the last time you asked what I wanted instead of assuming I wanted to help? The silence stretched between Chicago and Portland, filled with the weight of questions Jennifer couldn't answer. Mom, you've always been the one who wanted to help. You've always been happiest when you were taking care of others. Have I? Or have I just been so good at hiding my own needs that you forgot I had any? By Wednesday, the pressure was mounting. David called twice. Once to ask if I could babysit Tyler Friday night. I declined. And once to ask if I was going through something that required professional help. The second call particularly stung because it revealed how thoroughly my children had pathologized my newfound self-respect. In their minds, a mother who said no was a mother who needed therapy. I'm going through something, I told him. It's called finding myself, and I'm doing it without professional help, thank you very much. This isn't healthy, Mom. You're isolating yourself from family. I'm creating space to figure out who I am when I'm not being needed by someone else every minute of every day. That's what people do when they're having mental health crises, David insisted. They push away the people who love them most. The people who love them most. As if love could be measured by how much you demanded from someone rather than how much you gave. Thursday brought an unexpected visitor. I was in my garden, planting late-season mums in the small patch of earth behind my apartment building, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Those are beautiful, Mrs. Chen. I turned to find Mrs. Patterson from down the hall, the elderly woman I had helped when she fell last month. She was walking slowly, still recovering from her hip surgery, but her smile was warm and genuine. Thank you, I said, brushing dirt from my hands. I thought the building could use some color. It's nice to see someone taking care of things that don't take care of them back, she said, settling carefully onto the nearby bench. Plants don't argue with you or question your decisions. I laughed, surprised by how good it felt to hear someone understand. My daughter tells me you've been having some family troubles, Mrs. Patterson continued. Word travels fast in a building this small. I felt my face flush with embarrassment. I hadn't realized my changing relationship with David and Jennifer had become neighborhood gossip. Nothing too dramatic, I said. Just some adjustments. Adjustments, Mrs. Patterson repeated thoughtfully. That's a nice way to put it. I went through some adjustments myself after my Harold died. Took me 3 years to stop cooking dinner for 2 people. She paused, watching me work the soil around the mums with more force than necessary. You know what I learned, dear? Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who have the hardest time letting us change. They get comfortable with who we are for them, and they forget we might need to be someone else for ourselves. Her words settled into my chest like seeds, taking root in the space where my anger and guilt had been battling for dominance. How do you know when you're doing the right thing? I asked. Mrs. Patterson smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face into something beautiful. When it scares you and feels right at the same time, she said. That's when you know you're growing instead of just surviving. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment reading the book I'd abandoned the previous Sunday, my phone remained blessedly quiet. No emergency requests, no guilt-laden conversations, no demands for explanations I didn't owe anyone. For the first time in decades, I was accountable only to myself. The feeling was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I was beginning to understand that this wasn't rebellion. It was resurrection. I wasn't pushing my family away. I was pulling myself back together. I wasn't becoming someone new. I was remembering who I used to be before I disappeared into the roles other people needed me to play. And if my family couldn't love the whole person instead of just the parts that served them, then perhaps it was time to find people who could. Emma's voice on the phone was small and confused, the way it used to sound when she was 7, and couldn't understand why her parents were fighting. "Grandma, Dad said you're not making dinner tonight. Are you sick?" My heart clenched at the genuine concern in her voice. This was what I had been afraid of, hurting the innocent ones who had never done anything but love me unconditionally. "No, sweetheart, I'm not sick. I just decided to have a quiet evening. But we always have dinner at your house on Sundays. It's our tradition, our tradition. Not their obligation or my desperate attempt to stay relevant in their lives, but our tradition." From Emma's perspective, these dinners weren't burdens. They were constants in a world where so much else kept changing. "I know, honey, and we'll still have dinners together. Just not every single Sunday." "Is this because Dad was mean to you last week?" Emma asked, and her perceptiveness caught me off guard. "Tyler said he heard Dad on the phone complaining about you to Aunt Jennifer." So my grandchildren had witnessed their father's frustration with me. They had heard themselves being protected from their own grandmother, as if I was some kind of threat to their well-being. "Your father wasn't mean," I said carefully. "We just had an honest conversation about some things." "Adults are weird," Emma sighed. "Dad's been super grumpy since last Sunday. Mom asked him what was wrong, and he said something about you guilt-tripping him, but I don't even know what that means. David's ex-wife Sandra, asking about his mood. Even his former spouse was more tuned into his emotional state than I was. Emma, I want you to know that nothing between your father and me has anything to do with how much I love you and Tyler. That will never change, no matter what. I know, Grandma, you're like the most loving person in the world. Sometimes I think you love us more than you love yourself." The innocent observation hit me like a physical blow. Out of the mouths of babes, my 16-year-old granddaughter had identified the exact problem that had taken me 67 years to recognize. After I hung up with Emma, promising to take her and Tyler out for ice cream the following weekend, I sat in my kitchen staring at the empty stove. For the first time in decades, I wasn't cleaning up after a family meal. There were no dishes to wash, no leftovers to wrap, no dining room table to clear. The silence should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt heavy with guilt and uncertainty. Monday morning brought the first real test of my resolve. I had planned to spend the day organizing my closet, a task I'd been postponing for months, when my phone rang at 8:30. "Mom, I need a favor." David's voice was crisp and businesslike, the tone he used when he assumed compliance. "I've got a last-minute client meeting, and Sandra can't pick up Tyler from soccer practice. Can you get him at 4? In the past, I would have immediately rearranged my entire day to accommodate this request. I would have felt honored to be needed, grateful to be included in my grandson's life, even in such a peripheral way. "I'm sorry, David, but I can't today. I have plans." The pause was so long I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Plans? What kind of plans? The question irritated me. Since when did I need to justify how I spent my time? "Personal plans," I said simply. "Mom, this is important. Tyler needs to be picked up, and you're the only option I have. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You're very resourceful." Another pause, followed by a sound that might have been David grinding his teeth. "Fine. I guess I'll have to leave my meeting early and get him myself. That sounds like a good solution," I agreed cheerfully. "This is unbelievable," David muttered, apparently forgetting I could hear him. "First the dinner thing, now this. What's gotten into you?" "Nothing's gotten into me," I replied. "I'm simply learning to value my own time the way you value yours." He hung up without another word. The guilt hit me immediately. Tyler loved soccer practice, and the idea of him standing alone on the field, waiting for a ride that might be late because his grandmother had chosen organizing her closet over helping her family, made my stomach churn. But I forced myself to stay strong. David was a successful attorney with a flexible schedule and multiple resources. One inconvenience wouldn't traumatize anyone, and it might teach him not to take my availability for granted. Tuesday brought a text from Jennifer in Portland. "David says you're acting strange. Everything okay?" I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Everything's fine. Just making some changes in my life." "What kind of changes?" "The kind that put me first for once." Jennifer's response came quickly. "That doesn't sound like you." And there it was. The assumption that had shaped my entire adult life. That putting myself first was somehow contrary to my nature. as if self-care was a character flaw rather than a basic human need. Maybe it's time you got to know the real me, I typed back. The phone rang within minutes. Mom, what's going on? Jennifer's voice carried the same note of bewildered frustration I'd heard from David. First you cancel family dinner, then you won't help with Tyler, and now you're sending cryptic text messages. Are you having some kind of midlife crisis? I'm 67, Jennifer. If this is a midlife crisis, I'm planning to live to be 134. This isn't funny, Mom. David is worried about you. We both are. Worried. The word they used when my behavior inconvenienced them, but they wanted to frame their concern as love rather than selfishness. There's nothing to worry about, I said. I'm simply establishing some boundaries. Boundaries? Since when do you need boundaries with your family? Since I discovered that my family had been establishing boundaries with me for months without bothering to inform me, I thought but didn't say. Since I realized that loving someone doesn't mean making myself available to them 24 hours a day. Nobody expects you to be available 24 hours a day, Jennifer protested, but her tone suggested she knew the statement wasn't entirely true. Don't they? When was the last time either of you checked to see if I was busy before asking me to do something? When was the last time you asked what I wanted instead of assuming I wanted to help? The silence stretched between Chicago and Portland, filled with the weight of questions Jennifer couldn't answer. Mom, you've always been the one who wanted to help. You've always been happiest when you were taking care of others. Have I? Or have I just been so good at hiding my own needs that you forgot I had any? By Wednesday, the pressure was mounting. David called twice. Once to ask if I could babysit Tyler Friday night. I declined. And once to ask if I was going through something that required professional help. The second call particularly stung because it revealed how thoroughly my children had pathologized my newfound self-respect. In their minds, a mother who said no was a mother who needed therapy. I'm going through something, I told him. It's called finding myself. And I'm doing it without professional help, thank you very much. This isn't healthy, Mom. You're isolating yourself from family. I'm creating space to figure out who I am when I'm not being needed by someone else every minute of every day. That's what people do when they're having mental health crises, David insisted. They push away the people who love them most. The people who love them most. As if love could be measured by how much you demanded from someone rather than how much you gave. Thursday brought an unexpected visitor. I was in my garden, planting late-season mums in the small patch of earth behind my apartment building, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Those are beautiful, Mrs. Chen. I turned to find Mrs. Patterson from down the hall, the elderly woman I had helped when she fell last month. She was walking slowly, still recovering from her hip surgery, but her smile was warm and genuine. Thank you, I said, brushing dirt from my hands. I thought the building could use some color. It's nice to see someone taking care of things that don't take care of them back, she said, settling carefully onto the nearby bench. Plants don't argue with you or question your decisions. I laughed, surprised by how good it felt to hear someone understand. My daughter tells me you've been having some family troubles, Mrs. Patterson continued. Word travels fast in a building this small. I felt my face flush with embarrassment. I hadn't realized my changing relationship with David and Jennifer had become neighborhood gossip. Nothing too dramatic, I said. Just some adjustments. Adjustments, Mrs. Patterson repeated thoughtfully. That's a nice way to put it. I went through some adjustments myself after my Harold died. Took me 3 years to stop cooking dinner for 2 people. She paused, watching me work the soil around the mums with more force than necessary. You know what I learned, dear? Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who have the hardest time letting us change. They get comfortable with who we are for them, and they forget we might need to be someone else for ourselves. Her words settled into my chest like seeds, taking root in the space where my anger and guilt had been battling for dominance. How do you know when you're doing the right thing? I asked. Mrs. Patterson smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face into something beautiful. When it scares you and feels right at the same time, she said. That's when you know you're growing instead of just surviving. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment reading the book I'd abandoned the previous Sunday, my phone remained blessedly quiet. No emergency requests, no guilt-laden conversations, No demands for explanations I didn't owe anyone. For the first time in decades, I was accountable only to myself. The feeling was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I was beginning to understand that this wasn't rebellion. It was resurrection. I wasn't pushing my family away. I was pulling myself back together. I wasn't becoming someone new. I was remembering who I used to be before I disappeared into the roles other people needed me to play. And if my family couldn't love the whole person instead of just the parts that served them, then perhaps it was time to find people who could. Friday afternoon brought the confrontation I had been both dreading and anticipating. David appeared at my door unannounced, his face flushed with the particular kind of anger that comes from having your assumptions challenged repeatedly. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past me into my apartment without waiting for an invitation. I closed the door and followed him into the living room, where he stood with his hands on his hips like a prosecutor preparing to cross-examine a hostile witness. "This has gone far enough, Mom. Jennifer flew in this morning. She's worried sick about you, and frankly, so am I. This behavior isn't normal." "What behavior?" I asked, settling into my favorite chair with deliberate calm. "Being unavailable to solve your problems? Having my own schedule? Declining to cook dinner every Sunday for the rest of my life? You know what I'm talking about. The attitude, the sudden selfishness, the complete personality change. You're not acting like yourself, and how exactly should I be acting?" David began pacing, his expensive shoes clicking against my hardwood floors. Like the mother who raised us, like the woman who cared more about her family than herself, like someone who understands that families have obligations to each other. "Obligations?" I repeated slowly. "Tell me about these obligations, David. What exactly do I owe you? Are you serious right now? After everything we've been through together, you're going to pretend you don't know what family means?" I leaned forward slightly, my voice remaining steady despite the storm building in my chest. "I know what family meant when I was giving everything. I'm asking what it means now that I'm asking for something in return." "What are you asking for? Tell me what you want, and we'll figure it out." The question hung in the air between us, and I realized he genuinely didn't understand. After 42 years of being his mother, David couldn't imagine what I might want beyond the privilege of serving his needs. "I want to be seen as a person instead of a service provider," I said. "I want my feelings considered instead of managed. I want my time respected instead of assumed. I want to be loved for who I am, not what I can do for you." David stopped pacing and stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. "Mom, we do love you for who you are. This whole victim narrative you've created is ridiculous. Nobody has ever treated you like a service provider, haven't they?" I stood up and walked to my kitchen, returning with the small notebook I had started keeping. "Let me read you something." I opened to a page where I had been tracking our interactions since the previous Sunday. Monday. "You called asking me to pick up Tyler. No, how are you? No, is this convenient? Just an assumption that I would rearrange my day for your emergency. Tuesday. You called to check if I was feeling normal after I said no to helping. Wednesday. You called asking me to babysit Friday night, then suggested I needed therapy when I declined." David's face was turning red, but I continued. 3 conversations in 3 days. 0 questions about my health, my feelings, or my life. 3 requests for assistance or expressions of concern about my usefulness to you. Tell me again how I'm creating a victim narrative. Those are isolated incidents taken out of context. Are they? I flipped to another page. Let me read you something else. This is from the email conversation you had with Jennifer about me. The one you forgot was open on your laptop last week. David's face went pale. "Mom, you had no right to read my private emails. You left your computer in my kitchen with the conversation open. But you're right. I had no right. Just like you had no right to discuss my mental health with your sister without talking to me first. Just like you had no right to plan strategies for managing my emotions like I was a difficult client instead of your mother." I began reading from the notes I had taken. "Mom's getting unbearable. The guilt trips are constant. She acts like we owe her something just because she chose to sacrifice everything for us." "Stop," David said. But I continued. "Maybe we should limit contact for a while. She's become too dependent on us for emotional fulfillment." I said stop. I think she's having some kind of breakdown. Maybe we should look into senior living communities. The silence that followed was deafening. David stood frozen in the middle of my living room, his mouth slightly open, looking like a man who had just watched his secret life projected on a movie screen. "You want to put me in a nursing home," I said quietly. "Not because I'm sick or unable to care for myself, but because I love you too much in ways that inconvenience you." That's not... We weren't serious about that. It was just, we were frustrated and discussing my future without including me in the conversation. Making decisions about my life based on your comfort level rather than my needs. David sat down heavily on my couch, his head in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. "What do you want from me, Mom? Tell me what I'm supposed to do here. You're my mother. I'm supposed to take care of you. And now you're telling me that trying to take care of you is somehow wrong? You're not trying to take care of me," I said gently. "You're trying to take care of the problem I've become in your life. There's a difference. That's not fair, isn't it? When was the last time you asked me what I wanted instead of telling me what I needed? When was the last time you considered my happiness instead of just my function in your life?" David was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with concepts he had never been forced to consider. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted finally. "I don't know how to have a relationship with you that isn't the way it's always been. The way it's always been is me giving everything and you taking everything. That's not a relationship, David. That's an arrangement. So what now? You're just going to cut us off? Punish us for being the children you raised us to be?" The question revealed so much about how he saw our situation. In his mind, I was either completely available or completely absent. The idea that I might want something in between, a relationship with boundaries, love with limits, connection without complete self-sacrifice, was inconceivable to him. "I'm not punishing anyone," I said. "I'm creating space for a different kind of relationship, one where I matter as much as you do. You've always mattered to us. Have I? Or have the things I did for you mattered? Because those are very different things." The front door opened before David could answer, and Jennifer walked in without knocking. She looked older than her 39 years, her usually perfect hair disheveled from travel, her face drawn with worry and exhaustion. "Mom," she said, rushing toward me as if I were a patient who had just awakened from a coma. "Thank God you're okay. David's been telling me such strange things about your behavior." "My behavior," I repeated, looking between my two children. "It's interesting how both of you keep focusing on my behavior rather than examining your own." Jennifer glanced at David, who shook his head slightly, some kind of silent communication that excluded me from their understanding. "Mom, we're worried about you," Jennifer said, settling onto the couch beside her brother. "This isn't like you. The distance, the refusal to help family, the coldness. It's like you've become a different person." "Maybe I have," I said. "Maybe the person you knew was disappearing piece by piece, giving herself away until there was nothing left but the roles she played for other people." "That's very dramatic," Jennifer said, and I could hear the dismissiveness in her tone. "But it's also not true. You've always been independent. You've always had your own interests. Name one," I challenged. "Name one interest I've pursued in the last 5 years that didn't involve serving this family in some way." Jennifer opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at David for help, but he was staring at the floor. "You read," she said finally. "I read books that you recommended, or biographies of people you found interesting, or novels that might give me something to talk about with Emma. When was the last time I read something just because I wanted to? You garden?" "I garden vegetables that I use to cook meals for family gatherings. I grow flowers that brighten the spaces where we spend time together. Everything I do, even the things that look like hobbies, are really just extensions of my service to you." The truth was settling over the room like a heavy blanket, and I could see both of my children struggling with the weight of it. "So what are you saying?" Jennifer asked. "That everything you've ever done for us was fake? That you didn't really want to take care of us?" "I'm saying that I've spent so many years being what you needed that I forgot to be what I wanted. And now that I'm trying to remember, you're treating it like a mental health crisis instead of recognizing it as growth." "But families take care of each other," David said. "That's what love is." "One-way care isn't love," I replied. "It's dependence. and it's made you both incapable of seeing me as anything other than a resource for your convenience." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I saw her as the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "Are you saying you don't love us anymore?" The question broke my heart, because it revealed how completely they had misunderstood everything I was trying to tell them. "I'm saying I love myself enough now to require that you love me back in ways that honor who I am, not just what I can do for you." I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the neighborhood where I had lived for over a decade, trying to find the words that would make them understand. For 43 years, I've been Margaret the mother, Margaret the grandmother, Margaret the helper. I gave up Margaret the person so completely that even I forgot she existed. But she's still here, and she deserves to be loved too. When I turned back to face them, both of my children were crying. David silently, Jennifer with the hiccuping sobs of someone trying not to break down completely. "What do you want us to do?" Jennifer whispered. "I want you to get to know me," I said. "Not just the parts of me that serve your needs, but all of me. I want you to care about my dreams and fears and opinions and preferences. I want you to see me as a whole person instead of just your mother." "We don't know how," David admitted. "Then learn," I said simply. "Because the alternative is losing me entirely. Not because I don't love you, but because I finally love myself enough to walk away from relationships that diminish me." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Jennifer's quiet crying and the ticking of the clock that had measured so many moments of family drama over the years. Finally, David stood up. "We should go," he said. "Give you some space to think." "I've been thinking for weeks," I replied. "Now it's your turn." After they left, I sat in my living room for a long time, surrounded by the echo of words that couldn't be taken back. I had crossed a line I hadn't even known existed, stepped into territory that felt both foreign and familiar. For the first time in my adult life, I had chosen myself over my children's comfort. The feeling was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Outside my window, the sun was setting over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded me of possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice being the person I was learning to become. But tonight, I was enough. Just as I was, for myself. It was a start. 3 weeks passed without a single phone call from either of my children. The silence should have been devastating. For 43 years, my emotional well-being had been tied to their presence in my life, their need for me, their acknowledgement of my existence. But instead of the crushing loneliness I expected, something unexpected happened. I began to remember who I was. It started small. On the first Monday of my self-imposed exile from motherhood, I woke up without an agenda. No one needed breakfast prepared. No one required transportation. No one expected me to solve their problems before they'd even had their morning coffee. For the first time in decades, my day belonged entirely to me. I made coffee. Real coffee. Not the instant stuff I'd been drinking to save money for David's law school loans that had finally been paid off 3 years ago. I sat by my kitchen window and watched the morning unfold in my neighborhood with the unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere else to be. Mrs. Patterson walked her small terrier past my building, moving slowly but steadily in her recovery from hip surgery. The mailman, whose name I'd never learned despite seeing him 5 days a week for 8 years, whistled while he sorted letters. A young mother pushed a stroller while talking animatedly on her phone, her toddler pointing excitedly at every dog and bird they passed. These were the small dramas of daily life that I had been missing while I orchestrated everyone else's happiness. This was the world that existed outside the narrow focus of family obligation. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I went shopping for myself. Not grocery shopping for family meals or gift shopping for birthdays and holidays, but actual shopping for things I wanted simply because I wanted them. I bought a silk scarf in deep purple, a color I had always loved but never worn, because David once mentioned that it made me look severe. I purchased a novel by an author I'd been curious about but had never read because Jennifer thought her work was too dark. I splurged on expensive hand cream that smelled like lavender and made my skin feel soft as velvet. Each purchase was a small act of rebellion against the woman I had been. The one who asked herself not, "Do I want this?" but, "Do they need me to want this?" The sales clerk at the bookstore was a woman about my age with silver hair cut in a stylish bob and eyes that sparkled with curiosity. "Excellent choice," she said, ringing up my novel. "I stayed up until 3 in the morning finishing this one. Haven't done that since I was in college." "I used to stay up all night reading," I admitted, "before I became too tired from taking care of everyone else to stay awake for myself." She looked at me with understanding that felt like recognition. "Kids? Grown kids who never really grew up," I said, surprising myself with my honesty. "The hardest kind," she nodded. "They keep you so busy being their mother that you forget you're supposed to be your own person, too." Her name was Barbara, and she had owned the bookstore for 15 years after her divorce freed her from a marriage that had slowly erased her identity. We talked for an hour about books and solitude and the strange terror of discovering that you enjoyed your own company after spending decades believing you were incomplete without other people's needs to fulfill. "There's a book club that meets here Thursday evenings," Barbara mentioned as I prepared to leave. "Women our age, mostly. We read fiction, drink wine, and remember what it's like to have opinions about things that don't affect anyone else's life." I took the small card she offered, with meeting times and contact information printed in elegant script. "I'll think about it," I said. But I knew I would do more than think. For the first time in years, I wanted to be somewhere that wasn't connected to my identity as someone's mother or grandmother. Thursday evening found me standing outside Barbara's bookstore at 6:55, clutching the novel I'd finished in 3 passionate nights of reading and feeling nervous as a teenager on a first date. Through the window, I could see a circle of comfortable chairs where 6 women sat talking and laughing, wine glasses catching the warm light from overhead lamps. Barbara saw me through the glass and waved me inside with the enthusiasm of someone welcoming a long-lost friend. "Everyone, this is Margaret," she announced. "The woman I told you about who's rediscovering herself through literature." The introductions blurred together. Patricia, a retired nurse, Susan, a former teacher, Carol, who had spent 30 years as a corporate accountant before discovering pottery, Linda, who was learning to paint at 64, Diane, who had just published her first short story after writing in secret for 20 years. Each woman had a story of transformation, of finding herself after decades of being defined by relationships to other people. They spoke about their discoveries with the excitement of explorers mapping new continents, and I realized I wasn't alone in my journey toward selfhood. "The hardest part," Patricia said, discussing the memoir we'd all read, "is forgiving yourself for disappearing in the first place. I spent so many years being angry at my ex-husband for not seeing me, but the truth is, I had made myself invisible." "How do you stop feeling guilty about choosing yourself?" I asked, voicing the question that had been haunting me since my confrontation with David and Jennifer. "You practice," Linda said gently. "Every day you make small choices that honor who you are instead of who other people need you to be. Eventually, it stops feeling like rebellion and starts feeling like coming home." We discussed the book, a story about a woman who left her family to find herself. A plot that would have horrified me a month ago but now seemed like the most natural thing in the world. We talked about the author's courage in writing characters who chose growth over comfort, change over stability. When the evening ended, I realized I had spent 3 hours without thinking about David or Jennifer or Emma or Tyler. I had been completely present in my own experience, engaged with ideas that interested me, surrounded by people who valued my thoughts rather than my services. Walking home through the quiet streets of my neighborhood, I felt lighter than I had in years. The guilt was still there, a low, constant hum in the background of my consciousness, but it no longer dominated my emotional landscape. I was learning to carry it rather than be crushed by it. The following week brought an unexpected visitor. I was in my garden, planting spring bulbs for flowers I would see bloom next year, an act of faith in my own future that felt revolutionary, when I heard small footsteps on the walkway behind me. "Grandma?" I turned to find Tyler, my 14-year-old grandson, standing at the edge of my garden with his hands shoved deep in his pockets and his face flushed with embarrassment. "Tyler!" I stood up, brushing dirt from my knees. "What are you doing here, sweetheart?" "Dad doesn't know I'm here," he said quickly. "I took the bus after school. I wanted to see if you were okay." My heart ached at the concern in his young face. This child, who was navigating the turbulent waters of adolescence, had taken public transportation across the city because he was worried about his grandmother. "I'm more than okay," I said, gesturing for him to sit beside me on the small garden bench. "I'm discovering that I'm actually quite good company." Tyler smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from any family member in weeks. "Dad says you're going through something. Mom says you're finally standing up for yourself. They don't agree about whether it's good or bad. What do you think?" I asked. Tyler was quiet for a moment, studying my face with the serious attention of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "I think you seem happier," he said finally, calmer. "Like you're not worried all the time about whether everyone else is okay." His observation was so perceptive it took my breath away. I was worried all the time, wasn't I? "Yeah. Even when we were having fun, you always seemed like you were waiting for something to go wrong so you could fix it." "Ugh!" I thought about all the family gatherings where I had hovered at the edges, monitoring everyone's comfort level, anticipating needs before they were expressed, orchestrating joy like a conductor leading an orchestra that never seemed to notice the music she was creating. "Your dad thinks I'm being selfish," I said carefully, not wanting to put Tyler in the middle of adult conflicts, but needing to understand how my transformation looked from the perspective of the next generation. "Dad thinks anyone who doesn't do exactly what he expects is being selfish," Tyler replied with the brutal honesty of adolescence. "He's mad because you're not the same anymore, but he never asked if you liked being the way you were before." We sat together in comfortable silence, watching the late afternoon light filter through the trees that bordered my small garden. I had planted those trees when David was Tyler's age, thinking about the shade they would provide for grandchildren I hope to have someday. "Are you going to come back?" Tyler asked. "To family stuff, I mean?" "I don't know," I answered honestly. "It depends on whether your dad can love the person I'm becoming instead of just missing the person I used to be. What if he can't?" The question hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. Losing my adult children was one thing. Painful, but survivable. Losing my grandchildren felt like losing my future. "Then I'll love you from a distance," I said, taking his hand. "But I'll always love you, Tyler. Nothing will ever change that." He squeezed my fingers with the strength of someone older than his years. "I hope Dad figures it out," he said, "because I like this version of you better." After Tyler left, with promises to call me directly if he needed anything, and my assurance that I would never put him in the position of choosing sides, I sat alone in my garden as darkness fell around me. For the first time since this journey began, I allowed myself to imagine a future where my relationship with my children remained fractured, where holidays were spent alone, where grandchildren grew up without my daily presence in their lives, where the family I had built became a memory rather than a living reality. The thought was terrifying, but it was also, strangely, manageable, because I was no longer the woman who would sacrifice her own soul to maintain relationships that diminished her. I was becoming someone who understood that love without respect was just another form of abandonment, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to participate in your own erasure. As I locked my apartment door that night, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me was familiar but changed, stronger in the jaw, clearer in the eyes, more present in her own skin. For the first time in 43 years of motherhood, I looked like someone who belonged to herself. It was a beautiful sight. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning that painted Chicago in shades of gold and crimson, I stood in my kitchen preparing breakfast for one. The simple act had become a meditation on self-worth, choosing ingredients because I enjoyed them, taking time to plate the food beautifully, eating slowly while reading a book that no one had recommended except my own curiosity. The woman who had once measured her value by how many people she fed had learned to nourish herself with the same attention she had lavished on others. My phone rang as I was finishing my coffee. David's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, my old reflexes kicked in. The flutter of anxiety, the immediate mental inventory of what crisis might require my intervention. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by a calm curiosity about what my son might want after months of silence. "Hello, David." "Mom." His voice was different somehow, quieter, less certain. I was wondering if we could talk. In person, I mean. If you have time. The request for my time rather than the assumption of my availability was notable. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. I have time this afternoon, I said. Would you like to come here, or would you prefer to meet somewhere else? Your place, if that's okay. I'd like to see your garden. Tyler mentioned you've been working on it. Tyler. My grandson had been my secret lifeline during these months of family estrangement, visiting every few weeks with the excuse of walking past my building on his way to various teenage destinations. We had developed a relationship that belonged to us alone, not mediated by his father's expectations or my need to prove my worth through service. 2:00? I suggested. Perfect. And Mom? Thank you. I spent the morning tending to my garden, which had become a tangible representation of my internal transformation. The spring bulbs I had planted during my early days of self-discovery had bloomed and faded, replaced by summer perennials that were now yielding to autumn's more contemplative colors. Each plant had been chosen for my own pleasure rather than someone else's approval. The purple asters because they reminded me of the silk scarf that had been my first act of rebellion. The ornamental cabbage because its ruffled leaves made me smile. The late-blooming roses because their persistence in the face of approaching winter felt like kinship. Mrs. Patterson appeared at my garden gate, moving more confidently now that her hip had healed. She had become an unexpected friend during my months of family silence. A woman who understood that sometimes you had to lose yourself completely before you could find yourself authentically. Expecting company today? She asked, noting the extra attention I was paying to the garden's presentation. My son is coming to talk. The one who's been learning to see you as a person instead of just his mother? I smiled at her phrasing. Mrs. Patterson had a way of cutting through emotional complexity to reach the heart of matters. That remains to be seen. Well, if he's smart, he'll realize what a treasure he's been taking for granted. And if he's not smart enough, well, you've proven you can thrive without his approval. She was right. That was perhaps the most important discovery of these 6 months. I could survive, even flourish, without constant validation from my children. The knowledge had freed me to want their presence in my life rather than need it, to choose connection rather than accept obligation. David arrived precisely at 2:00, carrying a small potted plant I didn't recognize. He looked older, more worn than I remembered, but there was something different in his posture. Less rigid, more uncertain. Vulnerability looked good on him. These are Mum's, he said, offering the pot with the awkward formality of someone learning a new language. I asked the nursery worker what would grow well in a small garden this time of year. I hoped you might like them. The gesture was simple, but its significance overwhelmed me. For the first time in our adult relationship, David had given me something chosen specifically for my pleasure rather than his obligation. They're beautiful, I said, accepting the gift and gesturing for him to follow me into the garden. Perfect for this spot near the bench. We planted the mums together in comfortable silence, our hands working the soil with the shared focus of a task that required attention but not conversation. I noticed that David kept glancing at me, as if he were trying to memorize my face, or perhaps seeing it clearly for the first time. You look different, he said finally, as we settled onto the garden bench to admire our work. I feel different. Happier? I considered the question carefully. More myself. Happiness comes and goes, but being authentic feels more sustainable. David nodded slowly, his gaze moving over the garden I had created during our months apart. Tyler's told me about your book club, and the pottery class you started, and the volunteer work at the literacy center. He's become quite the spy, I said with amusement. He's become quite proud of his grandmother, David corrected. He talks about you differently now. Like you're a person with your own interesting life instead of just someone who takes care of our family. The observation struck me as profoundly sad and hopeful in equal measure. Is that how you used to think of me? As someone who existed only to take care of you? David's face flushed with embarrassment. I think I never really thought about you at all. Not as a separate person with your own needs and wants and dreams. You were just Mom. Always there, always willing, always sacrificing for us. I took that for granted. We both did, I said gently. I taught you to take it for granted by never asking for anything in return. But you shouldn't have had to ask. I should have been paying attention. We sat quietly for a moment, watching the afternoon light filter through the trees that had grown taller during our months of separation. Growth, I realized, happened whether you were paying attention or not. The question was whether you chose to nurture it or resist it. I owe you an apology, David said finally. Several apologies, actually. For treating you like an employee instead of my mother. For discussing your life with Jennifer like you were a problem to be solved instead of a person to be loved. For assuming your feelings didn't matter as much as my convenience. The words settled into my chest like seeds in fertile soil, not erasing the hurt of the past months, but creating space for something new to grow. I accept your apology, I said, but I need you to understand that I can't go back to being the woman I was before. That version of me was disappearing piece by piece and I almost lost myself completely. I don't want you to go back, David said, and the sincerity in his voice surprised me. Tyler was right. This version of you is better, stronger, more interesting. I want to get to know her. It means our relationship will be different, I warned. I won't be available for every crisis or request. I won't prioritize your needs over my own as a matter of course. I won't cook Sunday dinner every week unless I want to cook Sunday dinner. I know, and I'm okay with that. More than okay, actually. I'm proud of you for choosing yourself. The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering ground we had never explored before. David told me about his own struggles with identity after his divorce, how he had realized that he didn't know who he was outside of his role as a successful attorney and father. I shared my discoveries about the woman I was becoming, someone who enjoyed solitude as much as company, who had opinions about art and politics and literature that weren't filtered through other people's needs. For the first time in our adult relationship, we talked as equals rather than as mother and son locked in roles that had become too small for both of us. As David prepared to leave, he paused at my garden gate. Would you like to have dinner sometime? Not Sunday dinner at your place, but dinner out. Just the two of us. I'd like to hear more about your book club and your pottery class. I'd like that very much, I said. And Mom? If I start falling back into old patterns, treating you like a service provider instead of a person, will you call me on it? Count on it, I replied with a smile. 3 weeks later, Emma appeared at my door on a Saturday afternoon, her 16-year-old face bright with excitement and something that looked like respect. Grandma, I need to interview you for a school project about strong women, she announced, settling into my living room with a notebook and recorder. And after talking to Tyler and Dad, I realized I've been living with one my whole life without really seeing her. We spent the afternoon talking about my life, not just my role as mother and grandmother, but my dreams, my fears, my journey toward selfhood. Emma asked thoughtful questions about my childhood, my marriage, my career as a teacher, my decision to rebuild myself at 67. I want to be like you when I'm older, she said as our interview wound down. Not the old you who disappeared into taking care of everyone else, but the new you who takes care of herself too. You can be both, I told her. You can love people deeply and still maintain your own identity. You can be generous without giving yourself away completely. You can be kind without being invisible. As autumn yielded to winter, and winter softened into spring, my relationship with my family continued to evolve. Jennifer visited from Portland, curious about the mother she was getting to know for the first time. We had difficult conversations about the past and hopeful discussions about the future. Sunday dinners resumed, but on a rotating basis. Sometimes at my apartment, sometimes at David's, sometimes at restaurants where none of us had to cook or clean. The burden of family connection was shared rather than assumed. Tyler continued to be my most frequent visitor, delighting in having a grandmother who asked about his interests rather than just his grades, who shared her own enthusiasms rather than existing solely to celebrate his. I kept attending book club, where Barbara and the other women had become genuine friends rather than just fellow readers. I continued my pottery classes, discovering a talent for creating beautiful things that served no purpose except to bring joy. I volunteered at the Literacy Center, helping other women find their voices through words. On a warm evening in late May, exactly 1 year after my journey toward selfhood began, I sat in my garden reading by the light of solar lanterns I had installed because they pleased me. My phone rang, Jennifer calling to share news about a promotion at work, and I answered with genuine pleasure rather than desperate gratitude. After we hung up, I looked around at the life I had built for myself. It was smaller in some ways than the life I had lived before, less defined by other people's needs and schedules, but it was also fuller, richer, more authentically mine. I thought about the woman I had been a year ago, the one who measured her worth by how much she sacrificed, who disappeared into service so completely that she forgot she existed as a separate person. I felt compassion for her, but I couldn't imagine returning to her constraints. Love, I had learned, was supposed to expand you, not diminish you. Relationships were meant to celebrate who you were, not require you to disappear into who others needed you to be. As I closed my book and prepared for bed, I whispered a small prayer of gratitude, not for the pain that had forced my transformation, but for the courage I had found to choose growth over comfort, authenticity over approval, myself over the smaller version of myself I had been settling for. The woman who had once believed that being a good mother meant sacrificing everything had finally learned the most important lesson of all. You cannot give what you do not have. To love others fully, you must first learn to love yourself completely. And on this warm spring evening, surrounded by the garden I had planted and the life I had chosen, I finally did. Have you ever felt like you were disappearing into the roles other people needed you to play? Have you ever loved someone so much that you forgot to love yourself? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If this message resonated with you, please give this video a like and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps ensure that stories like this reach the people who need to hear them most, people who might be ready to remember that they matter too.